Welcome to 15 Minutes in the Book of Revelation. I'm Pastor Chester Hitchcock, and in this video we are dealing with chapter 17 that tells of a woman arrayed in purple and scarlet, riding upon a scarlet-colored beast. As with most of the book of Revelation, each verse is full of symbolic meaning that scholars agree and disagree as to their meanings. Nevertheless, despite the differences among the theologians, there are many things that the average Bible student can learn by simply keeping our eyes focused on Christ. As I have explained in other videos, Revelation doesn't follow a chronological order from beginning to the end, but rather circles back to the same time period time and again, namely that of human history, specifically from the cross to the second coming, and more generally from the creation to the second coming, looking at it from different angles. Clearly, we see that happening in the seven churches, the seven seals, the seven trumpets, and the seven plagues. However, there is a very organized pattern to the book, in nearly every case deepening our understanding as we go. For example, in the last video where we dealt with chapter 16 and Armageddon, I made the case for Armageddon being symbolic of the battle being fought on earth from the fall of mankind in Eden to the end, and most specifically and vehemently from the cross to the end. It is a battle between Christ and Satan for the souls of every person on earth. Some have referred to this as the Great Controversy, and the Bible refers to it as the Great Tribulation. Therefore, the Great Tribulation is actually life here on earth. I believe that I can demonstrate how the woman on the beast in chapter 17 will deepen our understanding of the great battle that is being fought between Christ and Satan for our souls. Let me begin by saying that chapters 17 and 18 are generally seen as a unit, though they maintain quite a distinct literary approach, 17 being directed toward Rome and 18 being directed toward Babylon, but we will see their connection as we work through these two chapters. It is important for us to notice in the beginning of chapter 17 that it is a sort of continuation of the seven bowl judgment, or the seven plagues. And keep in mind that the sixth bowl or plague was about Armageddon. Verse 1 of chapter 17 says, quote, "Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, 'Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters.'" In Old Testament prophetic discourse, harlot generally denotes religious apostasy. However, Mounce, in his commentary on the book of Revelation, which I have shared with you before, Mounce says on page 307, in the context of Revelation chapter 17 and 18, the imagery is not that of religious profligacy, but the prostitution of all that is right and noble for the questionable ends of power and luxury. He continues, the harlot is Rome. Then Mounce takes it where we have seen the symbols of Revelation before, namely from the beginning of time until the end. Mounce puts it this way: John's images are timeless in that they portray the essential conflicts of mankind from the beginning of time until the end. Therefore, while Mounce is claiming that John sees the woman on the beast as Rome, he also makes it clear that Rome is symbolic of evil that existed even before Rome. When we consider that Revelation chapter 17 verse 5 refers to the harlot as Babylon, we see once again, as we have seen several times thus far, that the Old Testament era and the New Testament era are being merged together in the symbols. This further supports the thesis of this book, Revelation, being symbolic of the battle between good and evil in every generation since the Garden of Eden. While some hold the belief that pagan Rome of old becomes papal Rome in prophetic imagery, it seems to me that it leads to an unavoidable theology of judging other believers, specifically Catholic bashing that was popular in the 19th century, but that theology doesn't stand the test of good scholarly research. It didn't back then, and it certainly doesn't now. Beginning at verse 7 of chapter 17, the angel responds to John's amazement by offering to explain the mystery of the woman and the beast who carries her. It is a single mystery which involves both the woman and the beast. While the remainder of chapter 17 is primarily concerned with the interpretation of the beast, chapter 18 through chapter 19, verse 5, details the judgment of the harlot. And the first thing that John learns about the beast in verse 8 is that it was, quote, was and is not, and yet will ascend out of the bottomless pit. It is clearly an intentional antithesis of Christ, the one who is, who was, and who is to come. This beast is the beast of chapter 13, who received a deadly wound and yet survived. Now, different interpreters in the past have connected this beast that received a deadly wound and yet was healed to Antiochus Epiphanes, to Nero, and even to the papacy. But as much as historians would like to connect this to someone or some human power, they fail to see the connection to the cross as well as to that of the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, God told the serpent that he, God, would put enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, and that he, Satan, would pierce his heel, but that the seed of the woman, which would be Christ, would crush the serpent's head. And that's in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. It was predicted in the Garden of Eden. And when Jesus was crucified, a spike pierced his feet or his heel. But when that happened, the cross plunged deep into Golgotha, which is called the place of the skull, symbolically crushing Satan's head or the serpent's head. At that point, Satan, the beast, received a deadly wound. In other words, he was, but then he was not. But then he arose out of the abyss from his deadly wound to do battle with the one who struck the deadly wound. Let me say it this way. That battle that was fought between Christ and Satan from Eden to the cross was won at Calvary. Satan lost, and he was not. But his deadly wound was healed according to Revelation chapter 13, and he arose out of the abyss to fight the battle like none other that had ever been fought before, a time of great tribulation like none since the beginning of time. And chapter 17 removes yet another layer of symbolism to reveal the battle. Babylon was the Old Testament symbol of wickedness, and Rome was the New Testament symbol that revealed the wickedness of the world in which Christ came the first time. It is not meant to reveal a religious system with all of its human errors, excusing other religious systems with their own human errors. It was meant to reveal the very incarnation of evil itself, its deep-seated hatred, its violent opposition to good in every culture and in every age. Rather than watching certain religious systems and pointing our fingers at their faults, we should keep our eyes on Jesus, so as to recognize the beast-like character whenever it shows up. Once again, Robert Mounce adds some insight in his book when he writes, "The beast was portrayed as an evil power who had appeared throughout history." Page 313. Notice how the woman is said to be riding on a scarlet beast in verse 3, but verse 1 referred to her as one who sits on many waters. Verse 15 tells us that the waters represent peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. Jeremiah chapter 51 verse 13 describes Babylon as a city that is by many waters. This again shows the Old Testament and New Testament connection, tying both of the generations or dispensations throughout history of mankind through the symbol of Babylon and the symbol of Rome. Verse 8 tells of how, quote, "those who dwell on the earth will marvel when they see the beast." Down through the ages, the most beastly rulers of nations seem to captivate the attention of the people at first, even getting people to commit actions that they would have never done were it not that they were so enamored by their leader. Verse 9 speaks of the 7 heads as being 7 mountains. Again, says the woman sits on the mountains. It also refers to the 7 heads as being 7 kings in verse 10. Now, lots of ink has been spilled trying to determine these symbols. Are the 7 mountains symbolic of Rome because Rome was built upon 7 hills? Probably so. Were the 7 kings symbolic of rulers in Rome from Augustus to Titus? As much as historians play a part in many prophetic interpretations, there always seems to be errors in the historical record that someone discovers many years after multitudes have been convinced that this is the real meaning. However, if scholars cling to a Christ-centered hermeneutic, a Christ-centered interpretation, they usually discover a reasonable interpretation that doesn't need a historian. For example, as has been explained many times in this series, the number 7 is symbolic of perfection, fullness, and completion. Therefore, while there may indeed be 7 hills on which Rome was built, and while there were certainly more than 7 kings or rulers in Rome throughout history, Mounce writes, quote, "In Revelation, the 7 kings represent the entire period of Roman domination, regardless of the exact number of emperors." And verse 11 arrives at the heart of the mystery when it says that the beast himself is the 8th king, who is at the same time one of the 7. In other words, he is not a human ruler through whom the power of evil finds its existence. He is that evil itself. Symbolically, the beast is Rome. Symbolically, the beast is Babylon. Literally, the beast is the serpent himself, Satan. Not a ruler that one can point to and quote his name or his title, but the seed of the serpent in every generation that amazes those on earth with their audacious words and deceives the multitude with their outlandish claims. Verse 16 speaks of how the beast turns upon the woman who sits upon it. Hans Leos, a German Lutheran bishop following World War II, authored the book titled The Valley of the Shadows about his experience during his imprisonment by the Nazis. He was at Dachau concentration camp before being transferred to Buchenwald, where he was held in solitary confinement and tortured to reveal the names of the clergy who were working to rid Germany of Hitler. In other words, it is essential that clergy stand up against those kinds of despots throughout history. And when they do, they are in danger. I visited Dachau in 2012 and cannot express the feeling one gets while walking around in a place where such atrocities were carried out. In his book, he wrote regarding the practice of a beast-like regime turning on itself. Hans Leos writes this, quote, "A terrible and mysterious law of political history, according to which every revolutionary power contains within itself the seed of self-destruction." Page 229. Leon Morris, an Anglican theologian from Australia, notes that the wicked are not a happy band of brothers, but precisely because they are wicked, they give way to jealousy and hatred so that, quote, "at the climax, their mutual hatred will result in mutual destruction." These beast-like rulers in history are not easy to identify at first. They have a knack for knowing what riles up the crowds, and some of it is well deserving of being riled up about. But these leaders prey upon that knowledge and upon their ability to influence the crowds. They cannot be identified simply by whether or not they understand the frustrations of the citizens. No nation on earth is capable of satisfying everyone, and no nation will ever find a leader that everyone will agree with their worldview. The only way to identify this beast-like power that shows itself in every age, whether it is during the age of the Old Testament patriarchs or in the 21st century, is in its character, not in its politics. And like it or not, according to Scripture, we not only live in this sinful world as Christians, we also have to be discerning of the leaders in this world. And if it didn't matter, and Christians really didn't need to be concerned with what the world leaders were doing or saying, there really wouldn't be any need for the many passages of prophecy throughout Scripture that warns us not to follow these leaders. There really wouldn't need to be multiple chapters in the book of Revelation that speak about the war called Armageddon, or the 7 last plagues, or the woman riding a scarlet beast. But as long as there are Bible teachers interpreting these prophecies not from a Christ-centered focus, but rather from that of pointing out errors of other people of faith in order to build up their own organizational strength, as long as there are Bible teachers and evangelists using fear tactics about a new world order based on their view of prophecy, rather than what we have studied thus far in this series of how things are going to be the way they've always been right up until Jesus comes, just as it was in the days of Noah when they were marrying and giving in marriage right up until the flood came. As long as there are Bible teachers and evangelists using fear to warn us of chaos and crisis and doom, rather than explaining that Christ will come when we least expect it, when people are saying peace and safety, rather than when we recognize that all the prophecies have been fulfilled and now Jesus can come. As long as these religious leaders continue to gaslight would-be converts into thinking that a beast-like leader will come in the future, rather than explaining how they have showed up in every age. And as long as sincere Christians are tricked into looking at the shining object that is shifting their eyes from the very basic amoral and failed character of leaders who are seeking power, many will continue to be deceived in every generation, and the great battle of Armageddon being fought over our souls between Christ and Satan will reveal more and more casualties to Satan. Unfortunately, those who try to raise their voices against such despots often are rejected by sincere people who believe the lies and the promises made by those seeking power through hateful words and foolish rhetoric. But as we saw in verse 16, it is not only those who oppose these power seekers from the start, but just like the beast turns on the woman that sits on him, these powers generally turn on those who go along for the ride, we might say, voicing praise for the power that they support. But the beast has loyalty only to himself. And as the German Lutheran pastor put it after being tortured in concentration camps, quote, "Their power contains within itself the seed of self-destruction. They destroy and divide their own forces." In the next video, we'll continue this discussion as we examine chapter 18 that deals primarily with the fall of Babylon, but keep in mind chapter 17 and 18 are seen as a unit, and I hope to see you there. Until then, God bless and be safe. And if you find this video to be helpful, give me a thumbs up. And if you have not subscribed to this channel yet, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell and choose all so that you'll get a notification the next time that a video is produced. God bless, and I'll see you in the next video.